At a small, quiet diner in a sleepy, little town, a woman calmly serves breakfast to a Hells Angels biker while everyone around looks on with fear and contempt. Suddenly, two police officers walk in. They question him, insult him, and try to force him out just because of how he looks. But the diner owner doesn't stay silent. She stands up for him, even knowing the whole town might turn against her. And the next morning, more than 200 bikers show up outside her diner, leaving the entire town in shock. Before we dive deeper into this story, tell me, where are you tuning in from? And don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow I've got a surprise waiting for you. Laurel Roberts wiped the counter for the fourth time that morning, her dish rag damp and fraying at the edges. It wasn't particularly dirty. She just needed something to do with her hands, while her mind circled the numbers again, the kind of math that didn't live on a calculator, but in a tired place behind her eyes. The lunch rush wasn't coming today. It hadn't come yesterday or the day before that. 4 customers, maybe 5, if old Earl decided he needed his tuna melt early. She'd used to call that a lull. Now it was the peak. She glanced at the register, knowing exactly how much sat inside without even opening it. Not enough. Not for the power bill due in 5 days. Not for the supplier invoices. Certainly not for the new fan the diner so badly needed. The one overhead clacked as it rotated slowly, doing more to mock the heat than fight it. Outside, the town of Elmidge baked under a high sun that didn't care about struggling people. The air shimmered above the cracked pavement, and even the flies buzzing near the screen door seemed sluggish. Elmidge used to move, Laurel thought. You could hear it hum, laughter spilling out of barber shops, engines rumbling from the factory, teenagers daring each other at the town square. Now it just groaned. When the textile mill closed 2 summers back, it didn't just take jobs, it took breath. Laurel's father used to say, a small town dies the way a clock stops 1 gear at a time. The people were still here, but the rhythm was gone. She folded the towel in half and leaned on the counter, her weight shifting onto her right elbow. Her other hand brushed a loose strand of dark brown hair from her cheek. She looked out across the dining room. Red vinyl booze cracked at the edges, salt and pepper shakers half full, napkin holders wiped down more than they were used. It was the kind of place that once felt warm because it had seen so many stories. Now it just felt tired. When the bell above the door rang, Laurel didn't even look up right away. It was probably Mr. Jennings again. He'd come in every Thursday for coffee and a muffin and spend an hour pretending not to eavesdrop on anyone else. She reached for the pot just as the diner went quiet. Not silent exactly, but changed. Like a breath had been sucked out of the room, and no one knew when to let it go. She looked up. The man who stepped inside was large. That was the first thing anyone would notice. He wore a leather vest over a faded black shirt, and his boots hit the linoleum with a deliberate weight. His skin was dark, his beard graying at the sides, and his shoulders broad enough to block out the sun behind him. The kind of man people noticed even if they didn't want to. His eyes swept the room in a slow arc, not challenging, not asking anything, just taking in the air and the people. And then he walked toward the counter. Laurel's stomach tightened. Not from fear, exactly, at least not the physical kind, but there was a stillness in the room now that she recognized. Every regular customer had either paused mid-bite or found something very interesting outside the window. Mrs. Hargrove's purse was now clutched tightly against her stomach. Two high school boys at the back booth looked at each other with eyebrows raised. The waitress working that morning, Tasha, had found an urgent need to organize sugar packets at the far end of the kitchen, past roof. The man didn't react to any of it. He moved with the steady posture of someone who was used to being judged. The second he walked in, someone who didn't need a reminder of how people saw him. He chose the farthest stool at the counter and sat down slowly, like he was careful with his weight, not just physical, emotional too, like he was carrying something. Laurel grabbed a menu, worn but clean, and walked toward him. Each step felt heavier than it should. She'd seen men like this before, back when she worked the emergency room in the city. Quiet types, ex-military, sometimes ex-something, always, often misunderstood, often alone. She offered the menu with a small nod. "Thanks for coming in," she said, her voice steady, if not warm. "Breakfast menu's up all day. We've also got a meatloaf special, if you're hungry for something heavier." He looked up then, and that's when she noticed the exhaustion in his eyes, pale, brown, ringed with red, like he hadn't slept much, or eaten, or both. There was a weariness there that spoke louder than his leather or his presence. "Coffee," he said simply. His voice was deep, but soft, like gravel wrapped in cloth. "Black, and whatever's quickest from the kitchen. I'm headed back to the hospital, and didn't want to skip a meal again." Laurel nodded and turned for the coffee pot, but she kept watching him in the reflection on the chrome behind the counter. His hands were large and calloused, fingers scarred, a faded tattoo stretching along the top of his right wrist. But it was the small plastic band barely hidden beneath his sleeve that caught her eye. A hospital wristband. "Eggs and toast, okay?" she asked. "Fastest thing I've got, that. Doesn't come out of a freezer." He gave a single nod. "That'd be fine, thank you." The coffee sat in front of him, steam curling upward into the stagnant air. Ralph didn't touch it at first. He stared at it for a long moment, as if the warmth could seep into him without needing to drink it. His hands were wrapped around the cup, not for comfort, but for control. Laurel noticed the faint tremor in his right hand as he adjusted his grip. It wasn't enough to draw attention unless you were paying close attention, and Laurel was. Years, working hospital shifts, had trained her to notice the small things, the shaking hands, the tightness in someone's jaw, the way a voice paused, not because they were finished speaking, but because they were trying not to break apart. This man wasn't just tired. He was stretched thin, in a way most people never admitted out loud. She didn't ask questions right away. Instead, she filled the silence with movement, checking the toast as it browned on the griddle behind the counter, cracking 2 eggs into the pan. With practiced hands, the sizzle helped drown out the awkwardness. Not for Ralph. He seemed immune to awkwardness, but for the rest of the diner, which had settled into that brittle quiet again, the kind where chairs didn't scrape against tile, where conversations paused mid-sentence and never resumed. When she slid the plate in front of him, eggs over medium toast cut diagonally, butter already melting, he finally spoke again, eyes still on the coffee. "That's more than I expected," he said, voice low, steady, a little hoarse. Laurel leaned lightly against the counter, arms crossed loosely, not looming, but not retreating either. "I figure if someone's got enough manners to order politely and keep to themselves, they deserve something warm." He lifted his eyes to meet hers. There was a flicker there, brief but unmistakable. Not surprise. Exactly. Gratitude. Maybe, or maybe just the kind of acknowledgement shared between 2 people who've each had long days, long weeks, long lives in different ways. He picked up the toast and took a small bite, chewed slowly, swallowed carefully. His shoulders, which had been sitting high like he expected a hit, eased downward a fraction. Laurel waited. She didn't rush. To him, that too was habit. People open up more when they don't feel pushed. After a minute, he set the toast down beside his plate and spoke again, not looking. "Up this time. Riverside Medical Center. That's where I'm headed." His voice had no upward lift, no drama, just flat facts laid out like weight on a table. Laurel nodded once. "We've got a few folks in and out of there from Elmidge. That's a good hospital." He gave a small huff, not quite a laugh. "It better be. It's the 3rd one I've tried this year. This one's got a trial program, experimental treatment." He paused. "Last option, really." Laurel let the silence stretch, then said softly, "For you." He shook his head once firm. "My daughter, Marina, she's 20, diagnosed a year ago. It's stage 4 now. They said it spread faster than they expected." He swallowed, and she saw the movement in his throat, a twitch of his jaw that said it wasn't easy to speak that sentence. She could have said a dozen things right then. All the typical responses, "I'm so sorry, that's awful." But she didn't, because none of that would land the way it needed to. Instead, she stepped closer and reached for the coffee pot. "Need a top off?" He looked at his cup, then nodded. "Yeah, please." She poured gently, then moved the pot away without saying more. He took another sip. This one longer. "She doesn't like me coming in looking like this," he said, finally, meeting her eyes. "The vest, the beard, says it scares the nurses, says it makes me look like trouble." I told her, "I ain't trying to look like anything. This is just what's left." That sentence sat between them for a moment. Laurel didn't interrupt it. She understood more than she let on. People didn't always choose what they became. Sometimes life made those choices for them. Ralph took a deep breath, chest rising slow and deliberate. She's a good kid, honors. The student wanted to go into social work. First semester of college, she fainted walking to class. That's how they found it. He rubbed at the back of his neck, with his left hand, his right still. Holding the cup, I sold my truck to cover her second round of chemo. Been riding since. Less gas, less bills. No, one stops a guy on a motorcycle and asks if he's doing okay. Laurel couldn't help. 8. Her lips pressed together and something tightened in her chest. She hadn't expected him to share all that. Maybe he hadn't planned to. Maybe it was just the first time in a long time. Someone asked without judging first. She rested her hands on the counter and leaned slightly forward. You're here. Now. You've got a hot meal. I don't know what you're carrying, but you don't have to carry it alone for the next 20 minutes. Not here, Ralph didn't say anything, but he nodded once slow. Then he picked up his fork, and in that, the moment, something shifted in the room. It wasn't dramatic. No one clapped. No one gasped. But the mood changed. Laurel noticed the teenager in the booth, pretending not to glance at Ralph, had stopped mid-sip. The older couple in the corner seemed more interested in their pie than the man in the vest. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. Ralph took a bite of eggs and chewed thoughtfully. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. He just ate. And Laurel, without saying another word, wiped down the already clean section of counter beside him and stood there, not guarding, not guiding, just present. After a minute, he said, "What's your name, Laurel?" She replied, "Lel Roberts. Nice place you've got, Laurel." She looked around at the chipped floor, the dim lighting, the crooked napkin dispenser. "It's got character," she said dryly. He smiled. "Just a little." "That it does." She hesitated for a beat, then asked, "You said you were headed back. Did you already come from there?" "Yeah. Slept in the waiting room last night. I just needed to get off the hospital floor for a bit. Needed air, noise, something that didn't smell like disinfectant." She nodded. "I remember that smell. Used to be a nurse." That caught his attention. He looked at her differently now. "What made you leave?" She looked away, ran a finger along the rim of a clean saucer. "My dad had a stroke. I came home to run the diner while he's in assisted care. Figured I'd stay 6 months. It's been almost 3 years. Ralph gave another one, of those half smiles that didn't reach far, but meant something. "Life's good at changing plans." Laurel leaned back slightly, resting on her heels. The plate in front of him was nearly empty. Now, he sipped his coffee again. She could tell he was deciding whether or not to say more, and then quietly he added, "She told me yesterday that if I ever got stopped again by the cops in one of these towns, I shouldn't say a word, just let it happen." Said it wasn't worth the risk. His jaw clenched, and for the first time there was a spark behind his calm. Not anger, exactly, but something close to. Heartbreak shaped like rage. Can you believe that? A 20-year-old girl telling her father how to survive a traffic stop. That's the world she knows. Laurel didn't answer right away. There wasn't anything to say that didn't sound like a slogan. So she did the only thing she could. She reached for the coffee pot again and said, "How about one more for the road?" And in that simple moment, he smiled, this time for real. Not wide, not long, but it was there. The kind of smile that said, "You see me." And maybe that was enough for now. The bell above the diner door jingled again, but this time it didn't carry the usual rhythm of a casual customer or a curious passer-by. It was sharper, more deliberate, like a warning. Laurel didn't have to look up to know who it was. She felt at first the drop in the air pressure, the shift in every posture inside the room. Forks paused mid-air conversations, halted mid-word. Tasha, who had been restocking coffee filters near the sink, froze with her hand inside the cabinet. Ralph, seated quietly at the counter, with half a piece of toast left, didn't move. He didn't need to. The reaction around him was more than enough to tell. To him, what kind of presence had just entered. Laurel turned slowly, coffee pot still in hand, and saw officers, Edwards and Taylor, stepping inside. Edwards was first, his boots loud against the floor, his thumbs hooked confidently on his belt, which sat high on his waist, too polished for a small town. Beat cop who claimed to just be keeping the peace. His partner, Taylor, was younger, late 22nd maybe, and wore the same uniform, but carried himself differently, less puffed up, more hesitant, like he hadn't quite decided whether he believed in the authority stitched across his chest. But Edwards, he didn't hesitate. He scanned the room, spotted Ralph in under 2 seconds, and headed straight for the counter, like he owned it. "Morning, Edwards," said voice, just a notch louder than necessary. It wasn't a greeting, it was an announcement. Laurel forced herself to keep her expression neutral as she stepped back behind the register coffee pot, now returned to its warming plate. Ralph didn't look up. He sipped his coffee slowly and continued eating, calmly, deliberately. He had been here before. Maybe not in this town. Maybe not this exact situation, but in this tension. He wore it like a jacket he never got to take off. Edwards didn't wait for an invitation. He leaned one arm on the counter close enough to Ralph's plate to invade space far enough to call it accidental. Taylor stayed back a few paces, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room like he didn't quite want to be there. "Don't often see your kind around here," Edward said, his tone casual but pointed. He wasn't smiling, not really. It was more a stretch of the lips, the kind people use when they're trying to get under your skin without leaving fingerprints. Ralph set his fork down, carefully wiped his mouth with a napkin, and looked up for the first time since the officers arrived. His face remained calm, unreadable. His voice, when it came, was steady, just grabbing. "Breakfast, before I head back to Riverside." He glanced briefly at Laurel, not for help, not for defense, just acknowledgement, a nod that said, "You were kind, and I won't drag you into. Put this if I can help it." Edward snorted, lightly, leaning back just enough to show the badge clipped near his waist. "Riverside, huh? Long way from here. What brings you through Elmidge?" The question, it had no genuine curiosity. It was the kind of question people asked when they already didn't like the answer. Laurel's jaw tightened. She could feel the heat creeping into her face, not from the summer air, but from the injustice, unfolding like it was routine. "My daughter's in the hospital," Ralph said, still measured. "I was there all night. Just needed to get some food before heading back." Edwards raised an eyebrow. "And you picked this place?" His gaze flicked to Laurel, then back to Ralph. "Interesting choice." Ralph didn't bite. It was open, smelled like real food. "That's enough for me." Taylor finally moved, stepping closer to his partner, but still not speaking. His eyes landed, Barsha, on the hospital wristband, partially visible under Ralph's sleeve. He looked like he wanted to say something, maybe even step in, but he didn't. Not yet. Edward smiled again, colder this time. "Mind if we see some ID?" he asked. His tone still carried the veneer of professionalism, but it was thin. Everyone in the diner could hear what was underneath. Ralph reached slowly into his back pocket, not nervous, just careful. But that was enough. Edward's hand moved instinctively to the holster, at his hip, fingers brushing the grip of his sidearm. The room held its breath. Laurel's heart thudded once hard, and she realized she had gripped the counter so tightly her knuckles were white. Ralph froze. His hand stayed where it was. He didn't move another inch. His voice came low, but firm. "I'm just getting my wallet." Edwards didn't respond right away. Then slowly, he dropped his hand from the weapon like it was no big deal, like he hadn't just made every customer in the room tense up. "Go ahead," he said casually, as if nothing had happened. Ralph pulled out his wallet and slid it across the counter. Edwards took it, flipped it, lit open, examined the license for longer than necessary, then set it down with just a little more force than needed. "Looks clean," he said, shrugging. "Still, we've had a few bulletins come through about biker activity in the area. You understand, I'm sure. Got to be cautious." Laurel couldn't stay silent any longer. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. "He's a customer," she said. "He's been polite, paid for his meal, and hasn't caused any trouble." Edwards looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "That's so?" he asked. "I didn't say he caused trouble, just being cautious." His words were laced with condescension, as if she were a child interrupting adult business. Taylor finally spoke. His voice was quieter than Edwards', is more reserved. "There's nothing in the system on him," he said. "License is valid. No warrants. He's not on any of the lists." Edwards ignored him. "Still, it's important we know who's coming through town, especially with a vest like that. People get nervous." Ralph pushed his empty plate slightly forward, folded his hands on the counter. What people get nervous about, he said calmly, is usually a reflection of what they've been told to fear. Edwards leaned forward again. And what's that supposed to mean? Ralph didn't flinch. It means, if the patch on my back is all it takes for you to question me, then maybe you should look at what that patch really means instead of assuming. Laurel could feel the tension tightening like a wire between them. The rest of the diner had gone completely still. No one moved. Even the air felt like it had stopped. She looked from Ralph to Edwards and back again. Then, with a steady breath, she reached for Ralph's coffee cup. "Would you like a refill?" she asked. He blinked once, then nodded. "Yes, thank you." She poured slowly, deliberately, and in that small act of service, she made a statement. Not loud, not defiant, but visible. Edward saw it too, his jaw shifted. "Just doing our job," he muttered. "You never know what kind of people pass through." Laurel met his eyes. "Now, I do," she said. "I talk to them. I listen. I serve them eggs and coffee, like everyone else." Ralph set his cup down carefully, not because he was done drinking, but because he could feel the weight of too many eyes pressing in from all sides. His jaw tightened just slightly as he stared at the rim of the cup, trying to keep his hand steady. Laurel saw it all. Every muscle shift, every breath held just a moment too long. The tension had settled like dust on the countertop, invisible but undeniable. Officer Edwards hadn't moved from where he stood, leaning with one hand against the counter, as if to remind everyone in the room who wore the badge. Taylor hovered a few steps behind him, his stance unsure, as if caught between his partner's posture and his own conscience. The words Edwards had just thrown out, words wrapped in smiles, but sharpened with judgment, still hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. And that's when Ralph did what every instinct in him said was safest. He stood up. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't aggressive. It was quiet, measured, practice, like a man who'd learned long ago that sudden movements could change a day or an entire life. He pulled a few bills from his wallet, left them neatly folded under his empty plate, and offered a nod toward Laurel. "Thanks for the food," he said, voice calm, low. "I'll be on my way." He reached for the edge of his leather vest and adjusted it slightly as he turned eyes, not meeting anyone else's. Laurel didn't move for a second. Then she stepped around the counter, blocking the narrow space between Ralph and the door. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't raise her voice or throw her arms wide. She just stood there, small compared to him, but steady. Her voice, when it came, was the kind that didn't need to be loud to cut through noise. "Ralph," she said, clear and firm, "your money's no good here today." He paused, not in defiance but in disbelief. His head turned slightly, brow furrowed. "Ma'am, I appreciate it, but I don't want to cause you any more trouble than I already have." Laurel shook her head. You didn't cause any trouble. You ordered a meal. You paid for it. You were polite. That's more than I can say for others." Her eyes flicked to Edward's, and the room felt like it shrank an inch. The officer straightened just a bit, no longer, leaning as if his spine remembered how to stand when challenged. "I don't think this is your business, Laurel," he said, tone colder. "Now we're just doing our job, making sure people know we're watching." "That's exactly the problem," Laurel replied. She didn't shout. She didn't lean forward or try to intimidate. She just said it like it was. The plainest fact in the room. You walked in here and decided he was troubled before he even said a word. You didn't ask if he needed help. You didn't care that he was tired or hungry or trying to get back to a sick daughter. You just saw leather and skin and made up your mind. Edwards frowned clearly. Not used to being talked back to, especially not in uniform. His mouth opened, but Laurel didn't stop. "This is my diner," she continued. "I pay the bills. I clean the floors. I cook the food and pour the coffee. That stool," she said, pointing to where Ralph had been sitting, "is mine to offer and mine to protect. If you've got a real reason to be here, some law broken, some report filed, you say so. But if you're just here to make people like Ralph feel small, so everyone else stays in line, then you can leave." Taylor shifted on, his feet clearly uncomfortable. He glanced around the room, catching the eyes of a few customers. Some looked down quickly. Others held his gaze for a beat longer. There was no applause, no a sudden show of support, just a ripple of recognition. Someone had drawn a line. Laurel stood on one side of it. The rest of the diner was deciding what side they'd be on. Edwards didn't speak for a moment. His face was stiff, his jaw working. Finally he said, "You're making a mistake. This town has a long memory, Laurel." She nodded. "Good. Let it remember that I treated a man like a man." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of tension, full of meaning, full of people holding their breath and wondering what would happen next. Edwards took a small step back, straightening his uniform eyes. "Hard. Come on, Taylor," he muttered, then turned and walked toward the door. Taylor hesitated. For just a second, he looked at Ralph and then at Laurel. His expression wasn't angry, wasn't smug. It was something closer to uncertain, like he was beginning to question the job, or the man he followed, or maybe just the line he'd never realized was drawn beneath his feet. Then he turned and followed Edwards out. The bell jingled behind them, louder than usual, like a gavel. Ralph looked at Laurel, his face unreadable. There was no smile, but his eyes had changed. They were softer now, touched with something unspoken. Gratitude, maybe, or relief, or just the quiet acknowledgement of a rare moment when someone else decided to carry the weight for a while. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I did," Laurel replied. "Because you shouldn't have to." Ralph looked down at the money still tucked under the plate, then picked it up slowly and extended it toward her. "At least let me pay for what I ate." She shook her head again. "You paid. Enough just walking through that door." He didn't argue. He folded the bills and tucked them back into his wallet. When he looked at her again, his voice was softer. "Thank you, Laurel," she nodded. "Come back any time." Ralph held her gaze for a moment longer, then walked slowly to the door. He didn't hurry. He didn't look around. He just walked like a man who'd found a place he didn't have to defend himself for once and wasn't sure when that would happen again. As the door closed behind him, the room stayed quiet for a moment longer. Then the usual sounds resumed. Cutlery against plates, a spoon stirring in a mug, but something had shifted. Laurel felt it, even if no one said anything. She walked back behind the counter, her hands shaking slightly now that the moment had passed. Tasha brought over a new pot of coffee without a word, her eyes lingering just a bit longer than usual on Laurel's face. Laurel didn't speak. She just nodded, and in that silence she felt something settle in her chest. Not pride, not victory, but clarity. She had drawn her line. She didn't know what it would cost yet, but she knew this much. She'd meant every word. Laurel unlocked the front door of the diner the next morning like she always did, her hand steady on the key, her thoughts already ahead of her, prepping the griddle, checking the coffee, going through the morning checklist, the usual rhythm. But something on the glass caught her eye just before she pushed it. Open, taped dead center in red marker, thick and slanted, like it had been. Written in anger was a sheet of paper that read, "No traitors in Elmidge. We..." Remember, the handwriting was sloppy, the tape hastily torn, but the message was clear. She stood there for a moment, staring at it as if her brain needed time to catch up with her eyes. Her mouth didn't move. Her expression didn't change, but her chest tightened with a familiar pressure. Not fear, just the kind of slow-burning awareness that crawls into your bones when you realize people have stopped whispering behind your back and started shouting from your door. She pulled the paper off, carefully, not tearing it, folding it, once before tucking it into her apron, a pocket like it was a receipt she wasn't ready to throw away. The diner inside looked the same, tables in neat rows, salt shakers, full blinds tilted to keep the early sun from baking the booths. But everything felt different, like the silence had deepened overnight. Tasha arrived 10 minutes later, her usual bounce noticeably missing. She walked in, head slightly down, eyes darting, once toward the trash can near the entrance, where the note had briefly lived. Laurel didn't say anything right away. She knew the signs. Tasha fidgeted behind the counter, adjusting the napkin holders, even though they were already perfectly aligned. "Lel," she said, finally not looking up. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Laurel nodded and stepped around the counter, her hand still damp from wiping down the coffee station. Tasha twisted the ring on her finger, once, then again. "My mum called last night," she said quietly. "She saw a post going around about the diner, about what happened with the cops." Her voice dropped even lower. "She's worried," said I shouldn't be involved in any kind of scene. Not right now. Not with everything so tense. Laurel didn't interrupt. She just stood still, listening. Tasha swallowed. I told her it wasn't like that. That you weren't doing anything wrong. That Ralph was just a customer. But she's scared. And look, I just need to take a little time. Maybe a week, maybe 2. Her voice cracked slightly at the end, and her eyes finally lifted to meet Laurel's. Laurel nodded once slowly. I get it. I'm sorry, Tasha added. Really? I can't afford to get caught up in something if it means losing hours somewhere else. You don't have to explain, Laurel said. Her tone wasn't angry, but it carried weight. You've always been solid. Do what you need to do. Tasha looked relieved, but not proud. She nodded, quickly, grabbed her things, and left, without asking if Laurel needed help, getting through the morning shift alone. The first hour passed in near silence. No one came in. Laurel kept busy, refilled sugar, restocked mugs, double-checked tech deliveries, even though none were scheduled. Around 9:30, Mrs. Henderson pushed through the door, with her usual handbag slung over one shoulder, her steps slower than normal. She nodded politely, slid into the same booth she always did, but didn't say her usual good morning or comment on the weather. Laurel brought over her tuna sandwich and sweet tea without asking for the order, but the conversation stayed short. You doing okay? Laurel asked gently as she placed the plate down. Mrs. Henderson looked up briefly, her face unreadable. Still coming in. Menin, she said. That counts for something. It does, Laurel replied. The older woman didn't linger like she usually did. No crossword puzzle, no half-hour of idle chat, just a sandwich eaten in silence, a folded bill left under the edge of the plate, and a quiet exit. By lunchtime, Laurel had served a grand total of 3 meals, one to Mrs. Henderson, one to a delivery driver who barely looked her in the eye, and one to a teenage girl who took her coffee to go and left the change in a rush. The bell above the door rang far less often than the buzz of the fridge motor cycling on. She sat at a corner booth around 2 inches, the afternoon, a yellow legal pad in front of her, and a pen tapping quietly against it. She'd been trying to make the numbers work for almost 30 minutes, but there wasn't a way to make it pretty. Rent was due in 10 days. Utilities were stacking. The delivery, scheduled for Friday, eggs, bread, fresh produce, was going to bounce unless something changed, fast. She pressed her fingertips to her temples and leaned back against the booth, her shoulders HHD, not from labor, but from tension, the kind that sat on you quietly for days and made every breath feel heavier than it should. No one had said it to her face, not yet, but the message had been sent loud and clear. In a town like Elmidge, you didn't have to be told you were being punished. You felt it in the quiet, in the avoidance, in the space that used to be filled with familiar faces and friendly nods. Now, even the ones who agreed with her, if there were any, kept their heads down. Laurel looked toward the corner of the diner, where her father's old picture hung, black and white, slightly faded but still clear enough to see the pride in his eyes as he stood behind the counter, in his apron arms crossed, smiling. That diner had been his life, and now it was hers, for better or worse. She hadn't stepped into this to be a symbol. She wasn't looking to make a stand. She had just seen a man being mistreated and decided not to let it go unnoticed. Her eyes burned slightly, but she didn't cry. Instead, she got up, rinsed her mug, and wiped down the counter for the third time that hour. The bell above the door stayed quiet, and the silence said everything. The first sign was a low hum, distant at first, like thunder rolling over the hills, the kind of sound you'd normally ignore until it grew too close to pretend anymore. Laurel stood behind the counter, wiping down an already clean menu, lost in thought when the vibrations reached the glass. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, steady and growing. She looked up, puzzled, then stepped out from behind the counter and peered through the front window. What she saw made her breath catch in her chest. Motorcycles, dozens of them, lined up down both sides of the street, stretching past the diner and wrapping around the corner. Some were still pulling in engines, rumbling low, like an approaching storm, but not. Chaotic, coordinated, calm, deliberate. Riders dismounted in pairs or small groups, removing helmets, stretching limbs, brushing off dust from long rides. They weren't loud. They weren't making a scene. They were just there, like an army that didn't need weapons to make a point. Their jackets bore patches, not all the same, but related. Regional chapters, memorial crests, brotherhood insignias. Some had flags sewn onto their sleeves. Others had names. Some looked older than her father. He would have been. A few looked barely out of high school. It was a wave of leather and denim, of weathered faces and quiet eyes, and it just kept coming. The bell above the door jingled once, then again, and again in rapid succession as the first wave entered. Laurel didn't move at first. She wasn't sure if she should speak or just watch. A man with a salt and pepper beard stepped forward, removed his gloves, and reached out his hand across the counter. "You, Laurel Roberts." She nodded, her voice slow to catch up. "Yes." He smiled, not broadly, but with a kind of respectful sincerity. "I'm Maxwell, Ralph's older brother. This is my wife, Tessa." He gestured to the woman beside him. Tall, silver hair pulled into a braid, her expression firm but kind. "We heard what you did for our family. You didn't have to. A lot of folks wouldn't have, but you did. You stood up when no one else would, and that means something to us." Laurel opened her mouth to respond, but before she could find the words, Tessa stepped forward and gently touched her arm. "We brought help." More riders poured in, taking seats, forming a line at the counter, greeting her with polite nods or soft-spoken hellos. A few simply placed $20 bills on the counter and asked for whatever's ready. Others offered to wait. No one complained, no one asked for special treatment. They just filled the space with quiet purpose, like they'd rehearsed it. "I don't think I have enough food for all of you," Laurel said almost apologetically, glancing at the limited stock in the kitchen and the single working griddle already warming behind her. "That's been taken care of," Tessa replied. "We called your suppliers last night, paid in advance. They'll be here in 20 minutes with everything you need to get through today and probably tomorrow, too." Laurel blinked. "How did you—" Maxwell gave a small shrug. Ralph told us. He didn't ask for help, just said, "Your diner was the kind of place worth protecting." The bell rang again and more. Bikers entered, standing patiently near the door until there were seats available. A few stepped outside to bring in coolers, drinks, extra napkins, whatever they thought might help. One of them, a tall woman with sun-sketched skin and dark sunglasses, walked up to Laurel and handed her a sealed envelope. "For you," she said simply. Laurel opened it. Inside was a stack of receipts, orders, placed with her suppliers for bread, eggs, buttermilk, coffee, paper goods, paid in full. At the bottom was a note, handwritten in block letters. "Friends of, the angels take care of their own." Laurel stood still for a moment, overwhelmed. The noise in the diner had shifted. It wasn't loud in the way a full house usually was. There wasn't the clatter of complaints or impatient sighs. It was the sound of conversation, of community soft laughter, the shuffle of boots against tile, the clink of silverware against ceramic. It was life. Returning to a place that had felt abandoned just yesterday. Tasha returned, just after 11, still wearing her apron, as if she hadn't missed a beat. "I figured you could use the help," she said. No explanation offered, and none needed. Laurel nodded and handed her a fresh order ticket without a word. By noon, the place was packed. Every booth, every stool, every inch of counter space was taken. A few locals hovered outside, curious, cautious. Laurel watched as one of the bikers, an older man with a long, white beard, offered his booth to a young couple standing at the door. "Food's the same no matter where you sit," he said kindly. "Come, join us." They did. Laurel worked steadily. Through the rush, her mind focused, but her heart unsteady in the best way. She didn't know half the people in the room. Some had travelled from counties she'd never even visited, but every single one. Part of them was there because of what she had done for one man. They hadn't come for vengeance or protest. They came with wallets, open sleeves rolled up, and eyes full of respect. Just after 1, a large man stepped up to the counter. He wore a vest that bore the Riverside chapter's insignia, and his voice was deep but warm when he spoke. "You must be Laurel," he said. She nodded, wiping her hands on a towel. "That's me. I'm Dill. I'm president of the Riverside chapter. Ralph's one of ours." He held out his hand, and when she shook it, his grip was firm but careful. "What you did for him," Dalzil continued, "you didn't have to." But you did, and we don't forget that. We don't forget the people who stand up when it's hard. So this, Dinah, it's ours now too. That means no one touches it. No one threatens it. Not without answering to a whole lot of folks who ride a long way real fast. When family's on the line, Laurel swallowed hard, but her voice didn't waver. I didn't do it to be protected. I know, he said. That's why you are the bell above. The door rang once more. Laurel turned, and for a moment her heart stopped. Ralph stood there, dusty from the road, eyes tired, but lighter somehow. He looked at her that same quiet way he had the first time he came in, but now it carried something else. Recognition, connection, peace. Hope you don't mind, he said, almost smiling. I brought some friends. Laurel laughed then, not loudly, not showy, just a breath of joy, let out after too long, holding it in. I think I can squeeze them in, she said. And in that moment, the diner wasn't just full. It was alive again. The diner had just begun to quiet down after the last rush of the day. Laurel had sent Tasha home an hour earlier, insisting she could handle the closing shift on her own. There was something therapeutic about wiping down the counters when the air was still warm with the scent of coffee and grilled onions, but the seats were empty. She moved with her sleeves, rolled up dish towel in hand, humming a half-forgotten tune her father used to whistle. It was a rhythm she knew well, and tonight it helped drown out the lingering worry about whether this peace would last. She had just emptied the trash when she noticed the back door had a faint glow underneath. Stepping outside into the alley, the dusk was turning into true night, and the temperature had dropped just enough to raise goosebumps on her arms. Then she saw a bright red spray paint across the back wall of the diner. It wasn't big, but it was deliberate. Traitor's Feed. Trash was scrolled across the brick, jagged and hurried. The kind of writing that came from impulsive anger, not careful planning. Laurel stood still for a moment. No tears, no shouting, just a long breath in the slow realization that, while the diner had been full of warmth earlier, not everyone in town had welcomed that moment. Inside, she pulled up the security camera footage from the night before. The grainy recording showed 4 figures slipping around the back of the diner after midnight, hooded, sweatshirts, quick movements, heads down. But one of them, just before leaving, turned toward the camera. His face was partially visible, lit for a second by the overhead bulb from the delivery side door. It was enough. Laurel froze the image and zoomed in. Jake Miller, she knew him. 17, maybe 18, came in every few weeks with his mum, liked extra ketchup with his fries, always said, "Thank you." His grandfather was Councilman Harris Miller, the same man who had once told Laurel she was too soft for small-town business. She stared at the screen longer than she meant to. She could call the police. She could show them the footage, press charges, let it become another battle. But some quiet instinct told her that wasn't the path she needed to take. She closed the laptop and picked up her phone instead. The next morning, Ralph was already sitting at the corner booth when she opened the door. He didn't say anything. At first, he just looked at her, then nodded, once understanding something had shifted. Laurel slid into the seat across from him and showed him the still image on her phone. "He's just a kid," she said. But he made a choice. Ralph studied the photo. His hands, large and weathered, rested gently on the table. "We can talk to him." "You sure that's the way?" "Words before fists," he said. "That's the rule we live by, even when folks think we don't have any." That afternoon, Ralph and DL went to the Millers' home. Tessa came too. Laurel didn't go. She stayed at the diner, heart pacing, like a slow drum as the minutes ticked by. She didn't know what would come of it, whether the town would erupt or the boy would deny it all. But she trusted them. The following morning, the door opened around 10, and Jake Miller walked in alone. No hoodie, no friends, no posturing, just a plain grey t-shirt, jeans, and a face red from either the heat or the shame. Laurel didn't greet him right away. She just watched as he stood in the center of the diner, stiff, like he wasn't sure where to put his hands. Ralph sat quietly in the booth. Again, DL was near the jukebox, arms crossed. Other customers had paused. Mid-bite, Tasha froze by the counter. Jake cleared his throat. His voice cracked a little when he spoke. "Miss Roberts," he said, not quite loud enough. He tried again. "I want to say I'm sorry for the wall, for the words. I didn't understand. I thought I did. I just said what I'd heard at home, and I thought if I said it louder, it would make it true, but it didn't. I was wrong. I see that now." He looked around, meeting eyes. Some faces were cold, some surprised, a few softened. He took a deep breath. "I'm sorry. I'll help clean it. I'll paint the whole wall if I have to, whatever it takes." The silence afterward was thick. Then Mrs. Henderson, seated near the window, stood up. She walked over to Jake, patted his shoulder once with a wrinkled hand, and, we said, "Takes guts to say what most grown men in this town can't." DL gave a short nod. Ralph looked down, smiling faintly. Laurel stepped forward and said, "Only thank you for coming." Jake looked like he might cry, but he didn't. He nodded quickly and left. Nobody stopped him. Nobody needed to. The words had landed. And for the first time in a long time, they left something clean behind. The letter arrived 2 days after. Jake's apology slipped under the front door sometime during the night. Laurel found it on the mat when she came in to prep for the breakfast shift. It wasn't in an envelope, just a single sheet of town council letterhead folded clean down the center. The ink was neat, impersonal, and official. She read it twice before setting it down and staring at the front window, like the street outside could offer some kind of answer. The council had called a special session. The diner, her diner, was on the agenda. The wording wasn't direct, but the meaning was clear. There had been concerns raised regarding the recent events involving out-of-town activity, public disturbances, and safety. Considerations connected to Parker's diner. The meeting was set for Thursday night, open to public comment. She didn't need a translation. They were coming for her. The days leading up to the hearing dragged and blurred at once. Some regulars still came by more now than a few weeks ago, but they didn't talk much about the meeting. Others avoided the subject altogether. The air around town was thick with unease, like the whole place was holding its breath. Elmidge had always been slow to change, slow to anger too, but once stirred, it had a habit of recoiling, like an old machine spitting out rust. Laurel spent every spare moment running through what she might say. She wanted to stay calm, to be measured. She didn't want to give them more reason to call her emotional, unstable, or worse. But every time she practiced in front of the mirror, something in her voice shook. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something older than that. Something like grief. Thursday night came too fast and not fast enough. The town hall was already crowded when she arrived. The main room, humming with whispered speculation and the kind of tension that crackled. Beneath polite smiles, she walked in, wearing her father's old cardigan, the one he used to put on when he met with vendors or tax collectors, anything serious. It still smelled faintly of coffee grounds and cedar. She needed that. Tonight, Councilman Harris Miller sat at the center of the panel, flanked by two other members whose names most people never remembered until election season. His hands were folded, his expression carefully neutral. But Laurel knew that look. It was the same one he'd worn when he told her years ago that keeping the diner open after her father's stroke was probably not sustainable. The meeting opened with routine matters, budget allocations, a zoning request for a new shed behind the hardware store, before Miller cleared his throat and announced the discussion of recent activities and their impact on community integrity. Laurel stood when her name was called. Her heart pounded, not fast, but hard, like each beat was an anchor. She walked to the center of the room, stood behind the small podium, and looked out over the faces gathered, some familiar, some closed off, a few encouraging, most unreadable. "My name is Laurel Roberts," she began. Her voice was even. "I own Parker's Diner. It's been in my family for over 30 years, and last month I made the decision to serve a man that many people in this room had already judged before he ever opened his mouth." She paused just long, enough to meet Miller's gaze, then continued. "He wasn't causing trouble. He wasn't breaking any law. He was tired. He was hungry. And he was trying to get to a hospital to see his daughter. I treated him the way I treat every customer who walks through my door, with respect." There was a small murmur in the back of the room. Miller raised a hand signaling silence. Laurel went on. "Since then, there have been consequences. My business was vandalized. I lost customers. I got threats. And now I'm here being told my diner might be a public concern, not because of what I did, but because of who I served. She didn't shout. She didn't break. But the silence that followed her words was thick. She let it sit, breathing through the ache in her chest. Then the door opened, and in walked Marina. She moved slowly, still, thin from treatment, her head covered with a soft scarf. But her steps were steady. Ralph was right behind her. So was Tessa. And behind them, dozens of others, riders, families, a few folks from town who had started coming back to the diner in the past week. Some didn't speak. They just filled the back rows, quietly, calmly, present. Marina stepped forward and stood beside Laurel. "I'm Marina Atkinson," she said, her voice soft but sure. "And if Miss Roberts hadn't stood up for my dad, I might not have seen him again. I was in a hospital bed thinking I might never make it out, and he made it to me in time because she let him sit down, have a cup of coffee, and breathe. That moment mattered, and I'm here now because of it." For a long time, no one moved. Then a voice from the crowd said, "She didn't do anything wrong." Another, "She did what was right." Councilman Miller cleared his throat again, but this time it didn't. "Command the room." Laurel stepped back from the podium. Marina held her hand. Together, they returned to their seats. As the council exchanged looks and scribbled notes, the vote came minutes later. Motion to issue any citation or investigation against Parker's Diner. Denied. No further action. Laurel closed her eyes and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for weeks. She didn't smile. Not yet, but she sat a little taller. Justice hadn't come in a wave. It came in that room in quiet. Voices and steady presence in the daughter who lived in the town that listened. The Saturday after the council meeting was crisp for late spring. The air had the kind of quiet that only came after a storm, clean settled, but not yet fully calm. Laurel arrived at the diner early, as usual. The chairs were still up. On the tables, the lights still off. But she didn't flip the switch just yet. Instead, she stood behind the counter, with her hands curled around a warm mug, letting the silence speak to her. She wasn't sure what it was saying yet, but she knew it was something different than before. She hadn't seen Marina since that night at the town hall. The girl had stood there like her bones were made of glass and steel, all at once, fragile but unshakable. Laurel had wanted to say something afterward, but the moment had passed, swallowed up by handshakes and murmurs and people filing out of the room, still unsure what they had just witnessed. Some kind of shift, a crack in the usual rhythm. So, when the diner bell chimed just after 10 and Laurel turned around to see Marina in the doorway again, this time without Ralph or Tessa, just her, it took a second for the moment to register. Marina smiled, thin and hesitant, but real. She was still pale, still walked like someone recovering from a long illness, but her scarf had been replaced with a short cap, and there was color in her cheeks that hadn't been there before. "I was hoping You'd be here, Marina said. Laurel smiled back, surprised at the swell of emotion in her chest. I think you knew I would be. They sat together in the booth by the window. No pretense this time, no crowd, no councilmen or bikers or reporters. Just two women, separated by decades, but tied together by one moment of decision. I wanted to come. Before Marina set her fingers tracing the edge of the napkin in front of her. But I wasn't ready. I think I needed the silence first, the kind that heals you a little before you start talking again. Laurel nodded, her voice quiet. I understand. And she did. There was something sacred in that silence, the space between suffering and rebuilding. I remember waking up in the hospital. Marina continued, her voice steady but low, and my dad was there sitting by my bed. He had that coffee cup from here. I remember the smell. It stuck with me for days. The nurse had to take it from him, to wash it. She smiled faintly. He told me what happened. What you did. At first, I thought he was exaggerating. You know the way dads do when they want to look strong. But then he looked away, and his voice cracked, and I knew it was. She paused, met Laurel's eyes directly. You didn't know me. You didn't have to do what you did, but you did, and it changed everything. Laurel looked down at her coffee, unsure what to say. Compliments like that were hard to hold. They felt too big, too heavy. I just didn't want to see someone treated like that. Not here, not in a place that was built to welcome people. Marina reached across the table and placed her hand over Laurel's. Her fingers were warm, steady. Then you built something more than a diner. They sat like that for a long time. The morning passed slowly, but neither of them seemed in a rush. Eventually, Marina asked for a small plate of scrambled eggs and toast. It was the first solid meal she'd eaten in public since her diagnosis. She finished every bite. Other customers began to trickle in. A couple of regulars nodded to Marina without hesitation. One older woman, Mrs. Ballard, who had once muttered about bikers ruining the town, brought her an extra napkin and asked if she wanted hot tea with honey. Marina accepted. The gesture meant more than the tea. After the rush faded and the afternoon light slanted across the booths, Ralph arrived. He didn't come to, make a scene, just walked in like any other father picking up his daughter. But when he saw Marina smiling, plate, empty hands folded like someone at peace, he froze for just a second. Then he smiled too. One of those smiles that start at the eyes and take over a whole face. I didn't know you were coming. Alone, he said, settling into the booth. I needed to, she replied, and I'm glad I did. Laurel poured him coffee, then joined them again. The three of them sat without needing to fill every second with words. There was a kind of understanding in the room now. A quiet bond made stronger by everything. They didn't have to explain. Before they left, Marina stood and looked around the diner. She took it all in: the counter, the photos on the wall, the quiet hum of conversation in the background. It's funny, she said softly. This place feels more like home than anywhere I've Been in a long time. Laurel smiled, her voice warm. Then it is. By the time the last Saturday of the month rolled around, the idea that had started as a quiet suggestion at the corner booth had grown into something bigger than anyone expected. It wasn't just a gathering or a meal. It was something closer to a reckoning wrapped in the warmth of shared food and human connection. Folks in Elmbridge had always been slow to open their circles, but this time something was different. Maybe it was because the story had made it outside the diner walls. Maybe it was because people had looked at Ralph in Marina and seen not strangers or symbols, but neighbors. Or maybe they were just tired of pretending things were fine when they weren't. The event didn't have an official name. Some called it Community Day. Others just said, "You know, the thing at Parker's." Laurel didn't call it anything. She just kept showing up early, ordering extra supplies, making sure there was enough pie to go around. Tasha and Jenny came to in on their day off to help prep. Even Dave Wilson showed up with folding tables he'd borrowed from the VFW hall. By 10 that morning, the street in front of the diner was lined with motorcycles, parked neatly like parade floats, their chrome catching the sun. Beside them were minivans, pickup trucks, a few old sedans that hadn't seen a wash in weeks. The crowd that gathered spilled past the P sidewalk and onto the side streets. Some wore biker jackets. Others wore church clothes. Some held babies on their hips. Others pushed walkers or leaned on canes. It wasn't just a biker thing or a towny thing anymore. It was everybody. Laurel stood behind the counter watching the people filter in, and for the first time in weeks, she wasn't counting heads or calculating ticket sales in her mind. She was just breathing, savoring the way the place sounded when it was full, not rushed or tense, but alive. At one table, Mrs. Henderson sat across from a broad-shouldered woman with a long braid, streak silver and grey. The two were deep in conversation about heirloom tomatoes. Over near the jukebox, Dave Wilson laughed with a younger man in a leather vest who turned out to be a history teacher at the local community college. A boy, barely out of high school, asked one of the bikers to take a picture with his gleaming Harley. The biker handed him the keys and said, "Sit on it, kid." The photo caught the boy mid-laugh. Outside, someone had brought a portable grill and burgers were cooking 2 at a time. Maxwell and Tessa stood nearby, helping pass out paper, plates, and bottled water. Marina was there too, weaving gently through the crowd, still conserving energy, but smiling in a way that no longer looked careful. Ralph stayed close, but not overbearing. He trusted her to be herself now. She had earned that space. Around noon, DL raised a hand and tapped a spoon against a coffee mug to get everyone's attention. The conversation slowed, then quieted. He didn't stand on anything. He didn't need to. His voice carried just fine. "I won't keep you long," he began. "Just wanted to say something real quick. What happened here? What Laurel did, it matters. Not because it's rare, though. It shouldn't be. But because it reminded folks what right looks like. And because of that, this place, Parker's Diner, means something more now. He paused, then looked toward Laurel. You gave a man a cup of coffee and a place to rest his boots. That sounds small, but you gave him dignity when others were trying to take it. You gave him time with his daughter. That's not small. That's everything. Laurel's throat tightened. She didn't trust herself to speak. DL went on. From this day on, consider this diner a stop on every one of our rides. Not just because of what it stands for, but because we want to be. Where people like Laurel Roberts are. People who choose decency even when it's hard. A cheer broke out, not rowdy, but strong. Then applause. Honest human applause. Later, as the sun began to dip, the crowd lingered. Some people brought out guitars. Someone had a speaker playing old country songs. Kids danced. Strangers played cards. Someone from the mayor's office even dropped by with a camera and asked if they could add Parker's to the town's tourism website under local landmarks. Laurel didn't say no. As the day faded into evening, Ralph found a quiet spot near to the back of the diner and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He looked over at Laurel, caught her eye, and gave a small nod. Mind if I say something? She motioned for him to go ahead. He stood, not at the counter or in the center, but just off to the side where people could see him if they wanted, or just keep enjoying their food. My name's Ralph Atkinson, he said, clearing his throat. Some of you know me, some of you maybe only think you do. That's okay. I used to think I knew myself too. A quiet chuckle rippled through the room. I came through here with nothing but a broken watch and empty stomach and a daughter I thought I might lose. I sat at that counter and I expected the worst. I've learned to expect it. What I got instead was kindness, plain and simple, and sometimes that's the hardest thing to offer. He looked at Laurel. Miss Roberts reminded me that strangers can surprise you, that a town, even one with its guard up, can learn something new. And maybe, just maybe, so can all of us. He folded the paper and put it away. Thank you, he said, and with that, the day carried on. More pie was served, more coffee poured, and as darkness settled over Elmbridge, something else oversettled too, a sense that maybe, just maybe, this town wasn't the same as it had been. Maybe it was a little better. And Laurel, watching it all from behind, the counter her father once stood behind, knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a better chapter. Thanks for sticking with us to the end of this story. From a small-town diner to a Hell's Angel finding kindness, this tale of standing up for strangers, overcoming stereotypes, and doing the right thing reminds us that human kindness can come from the most unexpected places. If this story moved you, drop a comment, tell us how it made you feel, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next chapter in this Biker, Brotherhood and Second Chances series. See you next time. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.